Can a game mechanic be sexist? In this essay, I am to interrogate. The answer is yes. And that may seem strange to you. A game mechanic is not a person. How can it be sexist? There has to be blame. We need a guy to blame. Where's the guy? Is the people who make games with romance mechanics sexist? Is the person playing a game with a romance mechanic sexist? Am I misogynist for playing Mass Effect? No. Playing Mass Effect just means you have bad taste in games, which is almost as much of a crime as misogyny, but I am not here to judge you as an individual. Because we are not talking about sexism in a personal sense, not sexism personified, but sexism systematized. Many people get all up in arms when you call things sexist. They panic because they see the word purely as this deep personal insult. If something is sexist, then that must mean total condemnation, for which proportional justification must be demanded. So don't do that. Be normal. What makes romance so weird? I'm going to answer the living shit out of this question. If you want a plain answer and course of action, you can just skip to the end. It would be more fun if you stuck around them. I'm just saying. The resemblance to traditional RPG mechanics is almost uncanny, which is what makes it uncanny. But why? You might think I just mean the old damsel in distress stuff, but no, I mean something more foundational. Video games are like any art form, iterative. So when a game developer decides to use this system, they are iterating on the most recent iteration, not looking deep into the past. All works build on and respond to previous works, and how they built on and responded to previous works, and how they built on and responded to previous works, and how they... Aesthetic and design trends come and go, but many mechanics have stuck around for longer than others, for better or worse. For example, the vast majority of games rely on killing dudes as a core mechanic, and as many have stated, this limits the range of what stories can be told in a game and how they are told, because they have to be about murders. Armed conflict is naturally political. But violent gameplay systems are prevalent mostly because acting out fictional violence is fun. Watch this. We don't make or consume violent games because we all secretly decide to murder people. The fiction doesn't align with our wants. At least literally, I hope. That part of the fiction is typically glanced over. By the time the controller is in our hands, it's far removed from its political heritage. That heritage is the normalization of extreme violence in video games as well as media in general, which is no coincidence. We don't need to do more than ask why a nipple gets you an 18+ rating while you basically have carte blanche on military violence to see the influence of Western conservative politics on media. This is part of why games focus on violence despite the breadth of topics and genres available. But it's not what we think of when pondering the origins of the gameplay system. The more immediate explanation of why it became such a universal design tradition is because it makes for engaging gameplay. Look at this guy. But what's closer to our mundane reality and very directly aligned with our human desires is romance. It is not as abstract as violence. It is to us a very intimate and relatable experience, which naturally makes for a stronger contrast when it's contorted into a gameplay system. The fiction here is in line with our wants. We're so familiar with the reality of it that experiencing it as a gameplay loop feels weird. But this weirdness isn't experienced the same way by everyone. We can engage with action roleplay without necessarily identifying directly with the protagonist. We don't insert ourselves in the headspace of the character, but instead the system is between us and the game. But with romance, the intent is for the player to become emotionally immersed, to step past the threshold of the system and actually roleplay as the protagonist, doing stuff we do in real life. Romance mechanics are typically a modified version of the framework used for violent games. As such, it has its own storytelling obstacles and its own baggage. When it comes to romance, those are larger obstacles. The unreality grinds louder, especially for women. RPGs with romance options utilize the gameplay framework that's already in place throughout the rest of the game. A romance system will typically use a quest system and good/bad dialogue choices for romance, the same way they might be used for something like faction reputation. This motivates the player to think about romance in a productive way, to optimize love like the rest of the systems. This mode of thinking about relationships clearly reflects historical attitudes. Like action gameplay, it has its own baggage. The system was originally created within a male-dominated environment where romance was sort of viewed this way, and so was implemented in a way that reflected that cultural climate when feminism was extremism and seduction girls were taken seriously. Now, they have been memed out of existence, leaving only the king, Richard Ruina.
Yo, what up, girl? Can I just talk to you for a second? Where you headed?
Busy.
Yeah? Come back here.
Oh, God.
So romance systems were originally purpose-built to sate the masculine fantasy of romance as a reward system, with women as the reward, of course. Simulations of romance date all the way back to the arcades, but the first combination of romance with RPG mechanics in the video game form was Dokumeki Memorial, developed and published in 1994 by Konami Entertainment of PT fame, was the first real romance-based RPG. Reading from the Wikipedia page because I will never play this shit because it's in a high school. The gameplay in Dokumeki Memorial focuses on scheduling, dating, and stat building. The player has limited time to allocate between asking out members of the opposite sex and developing the playable character's abilities at school and sport, with the long-term goal of becoming more seductive, not out of any intrinsic value. Dates are frequent but very brief, with usually only one multiple-choice question to determine whether the partner's love meter will increase or decrease. One playthrough lasts for a fixed period of 3 years of high school on the order of 5 to 10 hours of play, at the end of which the character with the highest love meter confesses their love. Does any of this sound familiar? It should. This is the basic framework we see integrated into most modern RPGs, though usually without the implications of the schoolgirl thing, you know. Were you to dig back farther, you would find mostly porn games about girls in a similar age range. Isn't this industry wonderful? But you don't have to dig that deep to see misogyny reflected in game mechanics. The game industry used to be fervently sexist. It still is, but it used to too. Naked, unashamed chauvinism is a thing of the past as it stopped being cool. But slightly ashamed casual sexism is not, and most insidiously, unchecked complacency about sexism, even in self-proclaimed feminists, is all over. That last one is kind of a minefield, so we're going to put a pin in that and examine the former two first. If a game isn't literally saying it's sexist, there will always be someone pointing to an older game saying it's not sexist because look at this one. Look how far we come. You're being crazy, and emotional, and confrontational, and defensive, and it's not that deep. It is true that the aesthetic of hyperbolic chauvinism is tapering off, but the gameplay systems we utilize which reflect that chauvinism have gone largely unchanged. Those mechanics and their function are inclined towards some degree of dehumanization. Even the wokest out games with content directly opposed to sexism look largely the same in mechanical terms. They're in a constant uphill battle to reject this baggage, and despite acknowledging and taking a stance against the attitudes that gave rise to the system they employ, they often inadvertently bring out a good deal of closet sexism due to the ways characters are folded into a reward structure. But also because it's taken as a given that you can't be sexist because it says it isn't, and it's mostly made by progressive individuals. Still, some people will be a little creepy anyways. We will save what I call the please step on me problem for a later section because first we have to get that game mechanics can indeed be sexist. Not for their presentation, dialogue, or depictions of characters, but in the heritage and inevitable output of their verbiage. As it stands, it is not about the content itself, it is the mechanic structure of romance options and its seedy origins that hamstrings stories of romance in our games. It is the problem of turning romance into rule sets. Cause ain't no rules in love.
Baby.
RPG systems rely on hard numbers. At their core, they are a translation of the common dice roll. The pewter replaces the human hand and voice that would have verbally communicated the outcome, and in that loses the aspect of collaborative storytelling in the tabletop format. And that's the first obstacle. There's not the same freedom to organically develop nuance in characters. You cannot color them in on the fly during play. For a video gaming, dialogue has to be written in advance with a user experience in mind. The gaming market, being what it is, puts artists between a rock and a hard place. You have to decide between convenience or complexity. The simple structure of the traditional male fantasy is cheaper and quicker. There's an established design language that allows for clear communication between writing staff and gameplay designers. The less malleable the narrative, the less chaotic the development process. With any branching narrative, you run into the old choices matter problem, often apparent in the output of studios like Don't Nod, Telltale, or Supermassive, wherein a character that was obviously supposed to fucking die at a certain point conveniently disappears from the story if you save them, because it doesn't make sense to write for an unlikely outcome. The same often goes for romanceable characters. Unless you've chipped the intended switches before a certain point in the story, you become locked out of the bulk of content pertaining to them. Going beyond even this, writers are deeply undervalued and considered replaceable in the games industry, as stories often considered secondary and their institutional knowledge, therefore expendable. You can spruce up a gameplay loop with systematic friction. You can lose healing items or miss some loot without much fuss because they're just objects. But people have to remember those mistakes if you want to retain immersion. Disappointing a potential romantic partner breaks the illusion of the fantasy, and writing and implementing dialogue related to that instance costs money to write. So to keep the traditional fantasy going, you have to treat the character like one of them their objects. But to preserve believability, you have to spend precious development time. If you're working within an RPG system, then these dependencies limit storytelling, because the reward structure doesn't readily allow for a humanistic portrayal of romantic partners. Now, this wasn't considered as much of a problem back in the male bubble of 90s game development, where casual sexism was abound, and this was often the way women were expected to behave. The damsels were in distress. Within the given parameters of an RPG, the effort to depict genuine romance is, in a sense, self-defeating. RPG romance, when viewed through a modern lens, is an oxymoron. Are we then morons for trying? Yes, because we are silly little animals. Play is an observable phenomenon throughout the animal kingdom. The various non-human little dudes of this earth all engage in some form of what we nebulously define as play. There's ample academic material in regards to the basic act of play, the way little dudes chase each other around, or how we throw balls around, or how we trick little idiot babies into thinking we disappear. These are pure forms of play, ones that use our body to interact with a set of rules without some other complex system in between. But for video games, that science is lacking. I don't personally think we need to know more, because I know if Otter could make a computer, I think they would also make Baldur's Gate 3, and that's all we need to say about that. But we allegedly live in a world where otters have no such plans. Allegedly. So we share the need with them for play. In Homo Ludens, don't laugh, play is defined like this. Summing up the formal characteristics of play, we might call it a freestanding activity, standing quite consciously outside the ordinary life as being not serious, but at the same time absorbing the player intensely and utterly. We find fun to be fun for a reason. It feels good to do because it's an evolutionary advantage. It has a role in cognitive development, but more importantly in the processing of emotions. Humans have big emotions. So big, in fact, that we had to play with more than our mortal yokes. Us human little dudes with our big stupid brains and tools have developed those other complex external systems of play. We got rocks and we make them do things. And at first it was just normal rocks with simple symbols on them, but then we made weird rocks with really small complex symbols that you put electricity in, and there you go, you're fucking a blue alien. Congratulations. Human play is complex. It is still an instinctual act. This also proves my point that otters would make games because they love rocks already. Think about it. They are well on their way. Imagine what video games an otter would make. Anyways, with weirder rocks came weirder games to process weirder and increasingly seriouser emotions, which is weird. Romance has serious emotions attached. Childishly, we desire a simplified version of it. Games are then a very convenient way to experience romance in a way that is fun. They simulate a version of it without its inherent difficulties. But it is more involved because our social systems and their coinciding emotions redefine that fun. We don't fully understand the emotions of our romantic partners, just like we don't fully understand our own. This incurs risk and uncertainty, and so we keep making different things into non-serious things because we need systems where those different things can be practiced in a risk-free environment, often one where results are comfortably predictable. But isn't romance about that unpredictability, about those difficulties? The answer is yes. This puts romance in an awkward position. If play is, as defined, an activity standing outside of the ordinary, then simulating and examining the ordinary within it seems quite weird indeed. The romance we try to explore in RPGs has intrinsic value. not necessarily related to its productive value of reproduction. Ew. It's the intrinsically valuable emotions of the experience that we want to explore, but we do so through a system that rewards a productive mode of engagement with extrinsic rewards. We don't typically get weirded out by this in other genres, but in the case of romance, the mechanics are much more counterintuitive to the theme. Most games pair their themes with mechanics that better align with our relationship to each. Action games use RPG mechanics as a stopgap between us and the implications of what we're doing in the game. And while mechanics can be this kind of neutralizing intermediary, that doesn't make them meaningless. Mechanics always communicate something, even when they aren't designed with a particular message in mind. Simulations in isolation, defeating an enemy, building an empire, or fucking a weird squid thing don't need an intended message to mean anything. Messaging is often serious, therefore naturally infrequent in a medium whose primary function is to escape seriousness. More often than not, it can get in the way of fun. Outside of exceptions like pathologic, fear and hunger, or papers, please, outright denial of fun is absent from the medium. The allegedly unsatisfying mechanics in these games are there to strengthen a complex emotional experience, but in that they do provide what we look for in play. They evoke complementary emotional states by inducing ludic friction. Pathologic 2, for example, is still built for the player to succeed despite the impression it gives off. A great deal of its supposed hostility is simple UI trickery, where all the RPG bars full and food items heal larger sections of them while instead draining at a faster rate, having an identical effect but looking different. The player would not feel as if they were barely scraping by. The player would feel stress, but the game would not imply nearly the same level of desperation. Pathologic, along with the rest of the examples, beloved as they are still considered niche because of the supposed hostility in their experiences. But were we to examine them outside of the myths that have been built around these games, we still see experiences that compassionately guide players through the emotions they're there to process. While not within the RPG romance field, these are games that break with established design tradition by contrasting the fun what makes them emotionally engaging, and in doing so bring out a wider spectrum of emotion. In game design, emotional friction is often seen as undesirable. It's supposedly something you want to minimize to maximize fun. But the two aren't mutually exclusive. A game system doesn't suddenly become meaningless when it's too fun. There's a good balance to be found in the recent Outer Worlds 2. A game which proudly touts its absence of romance mechanics after its predecessor provided an instant classic of in-game romance with Parvati storyline.
And no, you can't sleep with them.
In the marketing for the sequel, it is openly stated that the game will take something the player expects away from them. It frustrated many to hear the game say, "This is not about you, the player. You don't win. This romance is not for you." But my dear, my sweet, my buddy, my pal, my ragtime gal, romance is not logical. But also there is a logical explanation. Remember how I said RPG mechanics can dull the emotional impact of what it really means that the player is doing a murder by acting as a stopgap between the player and what's on screen? Well, it does that because it folds whatever the player is killing into its system. It dehumanizes the enemy. If that system is dehumanizing enough to make murder feel okay, what do you think it does to romance? It makes the fiction less relatable, not because you're in the shoes of the player character, but because non-playable characters are folded into the system as sets of numbers. The system is not just a stopgap for violence, but for love. And also, we are just plain compassionate. We can empathize with what's going on, even if it isn't happening to us directly. At least I hope so. It's not especially logical, but neither is the absence of a segue. So now we've established some ways of how romance could work gooder when contextualized differently, but the norm is still the classic reward structure. A game like The Outer Worlds goes against the grain of the wider industry when it comes to romance, and when Obsidian stood their ground on the no romance policy in the trailers for the sequel, people were frustrated. Put the romance back in. It sucks. So why do people still clamor for romance systems when they all complain about how shallow they are? It comes largely from the inexplicably popular view of games primarily as either toys or avant-garde protests of the medium. In the early days, games were generally marketed and consumed as entertainment systems, a toy with a screen. Some people view the evolution of the medium as the toys becoming increasingly complex, but still being functionally entertainment dispensers, just with increasingly fancy graphics. All the while, some weirdo artisanal bullshit creeps into the space to try and spoil the fun every now and then. The study of mechanics not as vehicles for the real expressions, but as their own expressions, is still largely done within
Anthropology?
when it comes to pure play, as we'd call it. A field of study that is boring because it does not have cause in it.
Anthropology is a very important field of study.
I'm pretty sure somebody's already named all the different spiders now.
That's arachnology!
I know! Equally huge waste of time.
Also present in Dark Souls is a very black and white view of things, at least in the early Age of Fire, to be clear. As such, there's a lot we don't know about what makes video games good. We often incorrectly take for granted that games have an obligation to satisfy, and with that expectation, another obstacle for romance appears. Games aren't an isolated medium. Where the meaning and purpose of an experience is taken for granted, the norms of society fill its vacant space. Something that is not transgressive of the norm is the norm. I don't know if you heard. Reward-based romance mechanics aim to quell a social unease. Traditional romance mechanics replicate and reinforce the traditional Western patriarchal ideal of romance. And taking for granted that reward-based romance is isolated from society and neutrally fun, we miss why the satisfaction in it becomes so hollow. We miss the reasons for why the satisfaction in it is so short-lived. We find temporary satisfaction in simulating the experience of achieving those patriarchal ideals, but it is never that emotionally resonant. When it is, it's not because of what the mechanics themselves express, but how much non-mechanical expression can wriggle its way out of their constraints. Every game has a unique constellation of artistic priorities. Some works are so focused on mechanics and isolation above all else that they can be likened to toys or sports in their employment of game systems. In other cases, mechanics can take a back seat to narrative. This is a very malleable hierarchy. Role priorities can intersect and contradict all over the place, and if I think about it too hard, my brain's gonna explode. The friction between these priorities is to me the strongest within RPG romance. You can make an argument for the anti-war war shooter, but by now that genre has come to terms with itself in satire. It played host to the early ludonarrative dissonance discourse about how universal violence is as a mechanic. As far back as 2003, Drakengard's story was an aggressive comment on the violence within the Musu genre. And then we had Drakengard 2, which fucking ruined it. Gaming genres as a whole are fertile ground for commentary, but some of the most interesting games are the ones that don't take an outside stance with their commentary, but directly explore different ratios between mechanics and narrative complexity within themselves. Thomas was alone, it's just squares jumping. Dear Esther is just holding W. Meanwhile, Mario is like a little bouncy toy, and Counter-Strike is more sport than story. But they all show how mechanics express something that provokes a reaction even at the rudimentary level. An adverse reaction to a work of art on any scale is direct evidence that the work is, on some level, provocative. Dear Esther was the boiling point precisely due to the simplicity of its mechanics. People asked if it was even a game. The discussion is nothing new, of course. The history of rendering a work within a given medium down to a form so basic it interrogates the bounds of that medium is common in games and in just art in general. While not intended as commentary because they're literally older than RPGs, romantic visual novels have a place within this same discussion. I have not played a single one, but I did say play, not read. You buy them on Steam, which is where the video game store explained with little video game babies. They are a preferred form of interactive romance for many. Many more statements can be made about them, such as them often involving clicking with mouse cursors, and the fact that they have visual and auditory elements. A lot of them are also creepy porn games that romance RPGs like Tokimeki Memorial were the direct offspring of, which I guess is more valuable information. Like the more discourse-weary action genre, developers of visual novels have done a lot of questioning of their own heritage. They're a bit ahead of romance RPGs in that way. At this point, visual novels poking fun at their own genre are more prevalent in core gaming than the genre's unironic entries. Doki Doki Literature Club or J Everything can be considered bookends for a certain period of the genre's history, marking a similar little postmodern renaissance to the ones we've seen in larger genres. These are relatively big-name contrarian works, but outside of the Outer Worlds marketing, mainstream RPG romance has only ever contended with its baggage in minor ways. Some video games, rather, make strides to passively reject the chauvinist baggage of romance mechanics, and some barely do more than slot them onto existing, largely unrelated gameplay systems. Take Lydia in Skyrim. When we first meet her, she gets a short and snappy introduction, so short to almost imply that the game is acknowledging her diegetic presence out of obligation. She's a sentient game mechanic more than she is a character. In continued interaction, we learn to recognize their dialogue more as UI noise, no different from the click and foom in the menus. She is clearly a vehicle to make a gameplay mechanic diegetic more than she is part of the fiction. Marriage to her, then, is functionally an extension of her toolset. More nodes on the skill tree, which on its own is fine. Skyrim is, like most Bethesda RPGs, a primarily systems-driven experience. The design intent for Bethesda has always been to produce games as a set of interlocking systems from which ludonarrative emerges. The much maligned Starfield, seen as an indicator of Bethesda having lost their way, shares the procedural generation and its intent with Daggerfall. It's a long-standing tradition, and this religious adherence to a systems-first approach naturally makes for companions that are, in essence, humanoid skill trees. They are the quest reward of an expanded inventory, a romanceable quest reward, even. Lydia's depiction in isolation is relatively progressive, emphasis on relatively there. In text, her womanhood has no impact on or relation to her capabilities in gameplay. She does not excel at stereotypically feminine tasks or lag behind in stereotypically masculine ones. She is sworn to carry your burdens, but she can carry as much as any male follower. That famous line actually struck me back in 2011 when I first played the game. So I have a great deal of love for Skyrim in that sense, but to circle back to my point, it is the neutrality of companions as gameplay tools that ultimately negates these positives because of how that neutrality is interpreted within gaming culture. Her popularity as a companion, owing to her early introduction as part of the main quest, led to her becoming the most common one to choose, which in turn led to her becoming a bit of a cultural object. As you can imagine, it did not take long for gamers to replace cultural object with sex object, and then you know what happens.
I mean, I know I woke up this morning and I felt like my boobs were bigger. I mean, do they look bigger to you?
What?
When nothing new is tried, tradition is reinforced. Naturally, this draws out the sexist heritage of traditional romance mechanics. Her sense of duty that was intended to act as pretense for her ludic servitude was decoupled from her character and reimagined as an expression of female subservience. Even though she was never sexualized or portrayed as secondary to men, her place in culture and in gameplay made for a sexist interpretation. You sort of have to fight back against these things preemptively, lest you unintentionally provoke this kind of, gamer behavior. It is only in isolation that her equal portrayal can be read as progressive, but within the transactional framework of the traditional system for romance, she becomes this sex object. Male followers, while no different in-game, are largely spared this treatment. And even when they are sexualized, it is not the same fantasy of subservience or nearly at the same scale. You can argue semantics about whether we can call a mechanic sexist, but my question then is, what do you call a mechanic that always produces sexism? It's the same thing for, the wage gap. Anyone can have a job, but society is going to interpret who is best fit for the job differently based on gender, because we live in a sexist society. While it is true that much of the above was examples of attitudes being projected onto characters, mechanics are not plain mirrors of society. The reasons for what emotions and experience is constructed to process will echo in its design one way or another. The view of romantic partners as rewards is a masculine perspective, a patriarchal luxury. So then, how do you make this system appealing to girls? Do you like curry? Then you probably know about Sonic, which means you probably have heard about Sega, and a guy who worked there called Yuji Naka, who lent his likeness to base the blue hedgehog off of. What you may not have heard about is a little 32 kilobyte game called Girls' Garden, released in 1984 or 1985, depending on who you ask. You can ask Yuji Naka. who co-developed the game along with Hiroshi Kawaguchi as his very first project at Sega, and he would say 1985. This doesn't matter at all. What is significant about Girls Garden is that it was a romance game for girls. It came out 3 or 2 years before Final Fantasy cemented much of the design language modern romance mechanics draw from. So why is it relevant? Well, it's a display of how romance mechanics, even at their simplest, reflect contemporary gender norms. In the establishment of politics in the book, it says here in my notes, politics. Yeah, in that book, a defining part of the political society is the function of women as currency, the value of which is dictated largely by how youthful the woman is. The pressure of women to get a man before time runs out is the essential mechanic of Girls Garden. You have a limited time to get a man's attention by giving him flowers before time runs out and he finds a newer, prettier girl than the avatar for the intended female player. I've spoken at length about the gaming industry's many misguided attempts to capture the female audience and how a reliance on gender roles viewed through a male lens led to failed products, which led women to break off on their own, seeking out romance gameplay that was not attached to the framework of the male fantasy, and visual novels, or by making fan fiction, again, moving video game characters into storytelling systems not constructed to say a chauvinist fantasy. The woman's role within a relationship necessitates an understanding of it that doesn't fit into a do quest acquire girl system. The resemblance to modern Western gender ideals that arises when trying to cater to a specific gender is not coincidental. The unique anxiety surrounding the opposite sex lends itself to different systems depending on who you're trying to appeal to. I'd speculate the high school setting of Tokimeki Memorial found popularity with the male audience in the West because for them, high school is a time when the other gender is inscrutable. Girls are distant, mystical creatures who act in a way boys do not comprehend. There is a chasm between them, bridging that chasm and having these creatures unravel before them, imagining a situation where they fawn over the player because they fill the love meter through understandable tasks is a clear form of wish fulfillment. Fulfillment of a delusional wish, because in love there are not the defined parameters of a singular system. Love, unlike these systems or the porn games they trace their heritage to, is mutual. One-sided interaction when the player is in full control over their romantic partner is voyeuristic and creepy and weird. The uniting factor of all the weirdness in romance systems is this inevitable creepiness of the system. It is a weirdness we will perpetually try and fail to circumvent as long as traditional RPG romance mechanics persist as the default. All media is to an extent weird in this way, I guess, but this is gaming. The overt weirdo shit of the genre's naissance is easy to point out and condemn, but I also want to point out and remind folks that just because things used to be creepier does not mean it's impossible to be creepy now. The general lack of respect for video games, no respect, as a serious art form combined with the perpetually muddy and half-ironic tone of online discourse, makes attitudes around the objectification of women in interactive media difficult to parse. As we discussed with Lydia, romance systems in the purely mechanical sense are neutral. They aim to say nothing, and then, like with any mechanic, the player will speak through them. An empty glass is full of air. A boat with no one at the rudder will be carried by the wind. The cultural geography of art is half its message. The meaning of romance systems is then revealed in examining their underlying cultural heritage. The attitudes that color those mechanics are, per internet discourse tradition, expressed with a sardonic tone which provides plausible deniability to whoever expresses theirs. We don't wholeheartedly and immediately adopt or express ideas as much as we tiptoe our way into a genuine stance by first joking about them. What this does is muddy what people think, both to others and to some extent themselves. Step on my fucking neck or similar comments of a sexual nature on a female character are usefully overblown. I bring this up because it is, despite its meme-like qualities, still a form of sexualization that can be problematic.
Don't be creepy is just not a good way to go, but in the game, cool, well done.
It's not something thrown out by the right-wing incels as a directly and rarely misogynist form of objectification, but rather the inverse. While sexualizing female characters and affirming the character is not subservient is not as overtly icky, it is still reducing a woman, even a fictional one, to her sex appeal. Like the mechanics that incidentally provoke players to project sexuality onto them, there is no overt or intentional misogyny here, but it is still kinda gross if you step away and look at it for what it is. It is something that cannot be neutral within its context. You can make both men and women objects to be pursued, systematically speaking, but objectification of women is not the same as objectification of men. Examining romance systems in the macro requires accounting for the cultural aspects that can skew our perception, the main one being the fact that these mechanics started out as an expression of sexist bias. The exponential growth of storytelling obstacles in games are owed to this fundamental flaw. How could you hope to tell a personal human story through cold hard numbers dependent on pandering to the gamer ego? Well, you can't, can you? So then you do something else. Video game systems still have so much untapped potential for storytelling because of all these outdated systems built to pander to the player rather than immerse them. When nothing new is tried, and outdated views unquestioned, misogynist tradition is reinforced. And that is why you should stop employing the